good morning. Thanks for joining us in this Healthy Ocean session. Hen and I are going to give you a 20-minute introduction, overview of the science program. But I'd like to talk, I'd like to start by giving a little bit of introduction to who I am. I know if there's students in the room, when I was a student, it was useful to see the career paths that others have taken. So I did my graduate work at the University of South Alabama, where I was trained there as an algal physiologist, and then I did a Canal Sea Grant Policy Fellowship. So that program that was talked about at lunch on Wednesday, I did that for a year. I worked for the United States Senator, and then went running back to academia, where I did a postdoc at the University of Texas Marine Science Institute. And then after that, I ended up going back to DC for both personal and professional reasons, and doing some work for NOAA's Office for Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, so that's their research arm, explaining what they do to Congress. So sort of marrying my science background with the year I spent as a fellow on Capitol Hill. My wife's job took us back to the Gulf Coast. One thing led to another. I was there when the oil spill happened. We got a chance to build the science program from the ground up, and now I'm fortunate enough to direct it. So now I'm going to hand it off to Hannah Brown to introduce herself. Okay, sure.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hannah Brown. I'm the Communications and Engagement Specialist for the NOAA Restore Science Program. I started with the science program less than a year ago, and I have a sort of interdisciplinary background. I'm a social scientist, a bachelor's in psychology from the New College of Florida, and then I went to the University of Florida for my master's and PhD, where I got a master's in mass communications and my PhD's in interdisciplinary ecology. So my research focused on oyster management in the Gulf of Mexico and stakeholder participation in management. I also had a fellowship after I finished my graduate work. It was with the National Academy's Gulf Research Program. And I interviewed with the science program at that time and ended up working for the state of Florida, but then a year later came back to the science program and was really fortunate to get this position. So we're going to be telling you about the science program today, but we are going to ask you some questions as well. And I'm just curious, I know we have a small group here, but how many of you would consider yourself researchers here? Awesome. And how many would consider yourself managers? All right, we got a little bit of both. And are you guys located in the Gulf region, or is everybody in the Gulf? Or
South Texas.
Yeah, all of us. Oh, cool. Awesome. Well, this will be relevant for you. Cool. Well, we can go ahead.
Yeah. So we're going to give you a quick overview of the science program. We'll be happy to take your questions, and then we'll have some questions for you. So let's get right into it. So the mission for the science program comes straight out of our authorizing legislation. Congress told us to carry out research, observation, and monitoring to support the long-term sustainability of the ecosystem. And then there was a bit of a call out to fisheries, both the fish themselves, but the fish stocks themselves, but also the industry. The way I've come to think about the program and like to communicate what the program is about is focusing on our two long-term outcomes. They're equally important. The first is we were interested in understanding the Gulf ecosystem as a whole. So we're not interested in just the fish or just the seagrass or just the ocean currents, but how it all ties together. Equally important, we're interested in the application of that holistic understanding. So we're not a basic research program. Basic research is important, but that's not what Congress told us to do. They said do research that's going to inform management in the near term. So I hit that earlier. So some of the other things that Congress told us to do, they said you need to coordinate with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So we have ways of doing that. They also said, given the importance of fisheries in the ecosystem, you need to coordinate with the two management bodies in the Gulf, both the Commission, which is the state agencies working together, and then also the Federal Fisheries Management Council. We do that as well. They also ask us to think of to prioritize integrated long-term projects. And so we've recently started making some investments along those lines, and then also to avoid duplication. Congress doesn't like to give money to two different groups to do the same thing. They'd like to see some efficiencies. And so we work on that as well. So in thinking about coordination, these are all the programs that were funded by penalty dollars for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So I'm not going to walk through all these boxes, but I just wanted to give you a feel for the constellation of programs that are out there. we're this program down here, the science program. We're funded out of the Restore Act Trust Fund. So a lot of the NOAA programs you've heard from this week are funded by appropriations. Every year Congress says, NOAA, you're getting this much money and this portion of it goes to this program. We're not like that. There was an oil spill, there were penalties. Those penalties are being paid, they go into a trust fund. We then draw money from that trust fund. So Congress gave us direction once, NOAA set up this program, do these things, and that's your pot of money. So it gives us a fair amount of freedom. Another NOAA program gives you a grant. That grant is contingent on them getting funds every year. We give you a grant, we're good for it. The money's sitting in our trust. We also coordinate with these programs. Other ones I'd like to point out is there are centers of excellence that are funded by the Restore Act. There's one in Florida. It's headquartered out of the Florida Institute of Oceanography. Monty Graham was here at the forum. He may still be here. He is the head of FIO. The National Academies of Program up here, that's the Gulf Research Program. They run a fellowship program. I encourage you to talk to Hannah's and others about that if you're students and you're interested in that. So when I say the science program team, this is who I mean. Myself, you've met, Hannah as well. There's also a gentleman named Frank Parker, who's our associate director, Caitlin Young, a science coordinator with us, a former fellow who we were able to hire on, and Miranda Madrid is a current Gulf Research Program fellow with us. She's working out of Austin right now. So our email addresses are up there. We try to be a high touch, good listening program. So if you have any questions for us at any point, reach out, please. Back on that funding slide, I talked about how much money we had a number for how much money we have, and that's 141 million. It seems like a lot, and I guess it is, right? So if you're a student trying to fund your research, which I was writing my own grants as a student, 141 million is a lot of money. We also get 25% of the interest in the trust fund, and that number could end up being quite high, depending on interest rates. So what do we do with that money? Well, so in general, what we're after is, again, prioritizing those connections in the ecosystem. On top of that application, you're learning new important things. Who's using that information? You need to know that before you sort of set out on your research. But more and more what we realize we're doing is we're building a community. So when we're done giving out the 141 million plus interest, if the type of work we're supporting doesn't happen anymore because no one's interested, they were only interested in the money, we failed. So what we're really trying to do is build a community of researchers and resource managers who want to work together to provide science that helps solve decisions that have to be made right now. So how we've given out the money so far is we do competitions. We put out a request for proposals. People send in proposals to us. We have a peer review panel who evaluates those and tells us these are the highest ranked ones. These are the ones you should fund. A wide variety of institutions are eligible, universities, all levels of government, for-profit sector, and nonprofit sector as well. We work in the Gulf of Mexico, not surprisingly, that's where the oil spills impact was. But if you work up in a watershed or a water body connected to the Gulf, and you work on a process or a species that has an impact in the Gulf, that's clear, then we can also fund your work as well. Our competitions, as I have said before, it's driven by those resource management needs. Early on, we asked resource managers, what are some things you'd like to know? Well, I'd like to know more about the life cycle of this fishery, or I need more habitat mapping in this area. And we run competitions focused on those needs. More recently, we've developed competitions where we ask teams to form a resource manager with researchers, pick a decision that has to be made, understand the uncertainties, and then design the research. To help us make those selections, we have review panels that aren't just researchers and aren't just resource managers. It's a collection of the two. We also go to the research community and ask them, hey, we're hearing this need on the resource management side. Is this a need you can answer? Is this a need you can address? Do you have the tools, the techniques? If the only issue is money, we can solve that. But if the technology or the tools aren't there yet, then we have to wait for the science to mature to address that particular issue. And so we funded 4 competitions already. We've got another one coming out this summer and a couple more behind that. Our first 2 competitions were designed to spend 20 million that came from the first 2 responsible parties from the oil spill that paid up. So we actually thought we'd run those 2 and shut the program down and I'd have to find a new job. But right around 2017, BP settled with the federal government right before I went on vacation, actually. And so now we have all BP's payments coming, and that's the bulk of our funds. So we ran a competition in 2019 focusing on long-term trends of living coastal and marine resources. So these are 5-year awards plus another 5 years of funding. So if you're getting a doctorate, you could easily cover that in your postdoc and maybe a year of being a research professor if you wanted to stay in the same institution. So these are long-term awards, fairly rare. And then recently we ran a competition for planning. We gave teams money to plan. We're going to chase that competition with money to execute actionable science. So again, that's the pick a decision that has to be made, understand the uncertainties, then design your research, and then go looking for funding for that research. So I'm going to pass it off to Hannah, and she's going to dive into a couple of our projects in more detail to give you a more concrete understanding of what we're about.
Seamless transition. Okay. So this is one of the projects from our long-term trends, the 2019 funding competition, and we call this the Firebird project. So it focuses on marsh birds and fire. And it's an interesting project. So funded for 5 years, and the focus is on management of 3 bird species, black rail, yellow rail, and mottled ducks. I think at least 2 of those are considered species of concern. And what happens with these birds is they all share the high marsh ecosystem, and they have different times of year that they use it for different purposes. So they use, their breeding practices vary. So managers use prescribed burning to manage that system, but if they do it at the wrong time, they may disrupt one species' breeding practices or another. So this research is looking at how to better manage that ecosystem with prescribed fire, and they're creating a model. They're using adaptive management. So it's sort of an iterative process of working with stakeholders and changing as they go along the goals and outcomes of the project. So they are far along in this, and it's been a really interesting process watching their stakeholder engagement. A very different project is, this is from our planning award. So that 2021 planning award that Julien just talked about. So this is a 1-year award that's focused solely on planning and scoping. And this is focused on Manatee thermal networks in Florida's Gulf Coast. So if just a little bit of background about manatees, they have an issue regulating their own body temperature. So they rely on warm water sites as refuges to help regulate that temperature. Those can be natural sites like springs, or they can be man-made sites like areas that have power plants and there's discharge coming from those power plants. So manatees actually go to those sites and rely on the warm water there. But along Florida's Gulf Coast, many power plants are going to be decommissioned, and the flows of some springs are declining as well. So there's a fear that there will not be places for manatees to go to seek this warm water refuge. And if you've been following the news on manatees have a lot of other issues going on as well. So this team is looking at identifying sites where they are now, restoring warm water sites when possible, and possibly creating new warm water sites as well. So they can create like a thermal network along the Gulf Coast to help support this species. And so they are in the process of planning, because this is a planning award. They have a stakeholder workshop coming up later this month. And so we're really excited to see what they do with this. So we do have an upcoming competition. So if we piqued your interest at all, you might want to keep an eye out for that. As Julien said, it's going to be for actually executing actionable science. These are 5-year awards. We have about $15 million allocated for these projects to give about 10 different projects. And like other awards, other competitions we've had in the past, project teams must include a resource manager, and they must have a specific management decision in mind when they apply. So we are really invested in making sure that the science we fund is actionable, that it goes to managers, that helps inform what's actually done. And this will open in June of this year. So I'll have a slide at the end that gives you our newsletter where you can subscribe. And so if you subscribe to that, you'll know as soon as it gets announced. So this, we're primarily a funding agency, but we are growing and evolving all the time. Even, with my position, I was hired about a year ago or a little less than a year ago, there's a whole new world of communications that's opening up to us as well. So we do other things as well. We're really invested in co-production of science, as you can tell, and we're trying to spread that idea to anyone who's interested, and especially early career people. So we've had some opportunities in the past to learn about co-production. We had a pilot workshop in the past. We've had webinar series, obviously conference sections. You're seeing that, live. We also have a synthesis initiative that's going to be announced in the coming months. And this is a partnership that we're doing with INSEES, and it's $3.5 million over 5 years. And it's about synthesizing existing data sets so that you can make connections and find new insights from data that's already existing. So there will be working groups that have specific topics they're looking at. And you can find out more about that too if you subscribe to our newsletter. And then communications and engagement. I'm really working to expand our audience and especially the applicants to our funding competitions. So if we have time, I'll have some questions for you about that. But if not, I encourage you to reach out to me with any suggestions you have on how our funding competitions can reach a broader audience. And then we're constantly trying to coordinate with other groups in the Gulf of Mexico and collaborate so that we're not, redundant in our efforts, but that we're using the networks that are already existing and just helping to, provide opportunities with the funds that we have. So here is our website. So you can go there, and at the bottom of the page, you'll see a place to subscribe. And that's the best way to keep in touch with us right now. We don't have any social media at the moment. So that's the place where you can hear from us. And we always want to hear from you as well. So please write down our emails. That's our cell phone numbers. Contact us with questions or ideas. If you're interested in our program, we have some opportunities as a student to be involved as well, like the Gulf Research Program Fellowship. So I'd be happy to talk to you about that if you're interested. And yeah, we can take any questions. And if we have time, I have some questions for you guys.
You guys mentioned about you are trying to avoid the duplication of research projects. In order to avoid that, since the Gulf of Mexico is so wide and there's other countries involved, do you also look at the duplication in that the other that institutions in other countries are also doing in order to not duplicate those kind of projects?
That are focused in the Gulf region?
Yes.
So Mexico specifically, or?
Yeah, Mexico, because I know there's a lot of institutions, particularly education institutions, universities in Mexico that are doing a lot of projects to help with the management of the Gulf coastal regions. So I was wondering if you're also looking at maybe their projects as well in order for there not to be duplication.
Great question.
Yeah, so most of our projects right now are focused in US waters. We have some open ocean work that's in international waters with the USEZ. And there's one project in particular looking at putting out a passive acoustic monitoring system to track marine mammals. That we had that very same question, and they actually brought partners from Mexican institutions to the table. So when we do have a project that's operating in areas where there might be research by other countries, we definitely ask them as part of our negotiations, are you working with other countries, who they are, and what can we do to help? That's a great question.
Steve.
I saw in one of the early slides, the mandate would involve protecting and restoring fish stocks, et cetera. Are we limited with this program to federally managed species, or would state managed species such as red drum speckled trout, bay scallop, some of those very economically important, but not federally managed species, fall under NOAA Restore, because they typically live with fisheries?
I would think there would not be a restriction. Like, we are open to any projects that are that have a specific management decision in mind. So the type of species doesn't necessarily, it's not a criteria whether it's federal or state managed species when we're looking at proposals.
Yeah, and several of our resource managers that are partners on projects with state agencies. So yeah, there's no restriction federally versus state managed. We've also taken a fairly broad reading of sort of what is fisheries and what is the ecosystem. So there, you can look at our legislation and see fish mentioned a lot in our mission statement and be like, oh, they only do fish. But the first word is ecosystem before it gets to the other sections. So we do a lot of work that isn't related directly. It's not classic fisheries work, but we think helps us understand the ecosystem of which the fish are.
Any other questions? Yeah, so I'm curious, after hearing about this, are you guys interested in applied research? Can I just see like a hand raise? Cool. So one of the things that we're interested in doing is hosting workshops in the future that have a specific management decision in mind, an area where there's a clear need for science. Are there any ideas, just after hearing some examples of our funded projects, of what would be a good topic to focus on for a workshop like that in this region? Kind of a lot to ask right now, maybe early in the morning.
Are you saying like in the northern Gulf, like around Tallahassee? Maybe I know like the oyster, whatever they call them, oyster population in Apalachicola has dropped. So maybe something to do like looking at oysters and maybe with the oil spill.
It's a great idea.
Maybe possibly aquaculture related in relation to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there could be a lot of different things to discuss within a oyster workshop for sure. Other ideas?
Yeah.
I appreciate you really thinking about it. Yeah,
Well, I mean, I just know over the last 12 years or so, there's been a lot, I've been part of a lot of funded efforts, other BP monies, with Gulf Marine National Academy Science Scope Research Program and all the different possibilities out there, developing new science, and a lot of this has been tools. And although these have been good, these have been often 5-year, 3-year type grants, they still have an end. And once the new capabilities or tools or understandings are developed, there's not necessarily that continuation with a lot of them. So looking back, maybe it goes along with the synthesis idea, looking back and see what has been developed, what has been collected, analyzed, learned, and seeing how it can be taken to the next step and actually put forth for ecosystem restoration and management. So it's sort of the application of stuff that's been developed over the last 4 years.
so using sort of existing data sets and
Tools and capabilities and models so synthesizing, not just synthesizing data, but synthesizing some of the outcomes, particularly of the multitude of studies that have been funded at BP, maybe going back to the original Gulf Consortia and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. We may need to follow up with you on that later. Yes.
So this is kind of inspired by the oyster question, but could there be a place for having workshops to train people to train citizen science for things like water quality testing, other things that you could have to sort of create maybe a somewhat more decentralized net of citizen scientists trained in stuff that would be specifically applicable to the mission, and also make sure that you're using methods that are quality and useful. Because I know that there's a lot of people who are interested in that kind of thing who just don't have any resources to go to figure out what is actually worth pursuing. And I did an oyster project with citizen science once, and it was super time consuming. And if it wasn't, if we didn't know that we were asking them to do reasonable stuff.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying maybe if there was some more training in advance, it would have been.
Yeah, and maybe with the benefit of a little bit of regional standardization as well, right? So that you can make sure that people in the region are using a similar suite of tests so that you can do direct comparisons.
Yeah, and maybe more likely then that data could be used more likely.
Right, exactly, yeah, and if you can start with something that has been, designed for use by non-technically trained people, then you can make sure that you're giving them things that you can play with. Yeah.
Awesome.
I like that. Who's the one that gave that idea? Just like,
Dr. Ross.
oh,
To piggyback off of that great idea, there are private labs as well as public labs that will definitely cooperate and partner up with the QA/QC portion of citizen science projects to kind of validate or help validate or improve their validation of their data. So it's not just you guys going at it alone with citizen science and hopefully they come out with some good data, but there are, professionals who want to partner up.
So perhaps that would be a good partner to include in a workshop.
In a
like that.
citizen or community science, whatever it's called nowadays.
Yeah, I think citizen science is
Citizen
the,
science.
possibly the preferred.
I'm gonna have to stop us there.
Well, thank you all so much for those ideas.